What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health. Tuesdays, 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern, on Pacifica affiliates WXOJ Lpfm, Northampton, Massachusetts, and KWMD in Kasilof and Anchorage, Alaska. Produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project, streaming, podcasting, and archived at madnessradio.net. Thanks for tuning in to Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall. Today we're talking about the International Hearing Voices movement, and our guest from the United Kingdom is Jacqui Dillon. Jacqui is a voice hearer, and she's chair of the Hearing Voices Network in England and actively involved in the International Hearing Voices movement. So thank you for joining us on Madness Radio, Jacqui Dillon.
Hi there, Will. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks a lot for joining us, Jacqui. It's really great to have you on the show. I had the pleasure of meeting you several years ago when I was traveling in England, and I know you're a really important campaigner and activist and leader in the International Hearing Voices movement. And I would love to take this time to hear more about that and to talk about the experiences of people who hear voices and how the movement is providing different ways of support. Maybe we can start out by talking about, your own experience. You're someone who hears voices, and maybe you can tell us about that.
Sure. Well, I've heard voices for as long as I can remember, really. I can first remember clearly hearing voices when I was about 3 years old in nursery school, and I could hear voices in my head talking about me. And for quite a lot of my early childhood, the voices were quite positive. They were very comforting and made me feel less alone. There was one voice that has been there kind of persistently, really, throughout my life, the voice of the Great Mother. And she was a voice that would come to me and comfort me and soothe me. And she's provided a lot of support really throughout my life. But as I got older and my life became more complicated, that was kind of reflected through my voices really, and they became more negative and more critical. Although I still heard positive voices, so I had a kind of a more complex relationship. And yeah, it's something that's kind of been there in different ways through my whole life really.
Now, when you were a kid, did you tell your parents or adults that you were hearing voices? Did you have any trouble with that? It sounds like they were pretty positive at that point.
They were positive, although I guess they were distracting and intrusive. I remember being about 6 or 7 and having real problems getting to sleep, and sort of trying to go to sleep and just hearing a lot of voices and it being very noisy in my head, and sort of naturally developing a sort of strategy by using a radio to kind of distract myself. But I guess because I was sort of growing up in a very unsafe environment, it wasn't something that I would have talked to people about. And in part, I guess, I knew it was connected to the bad things that were happening. So a lot of it was my way of coping, and it felt quite private, really, not something that I could have easily shared with people.
Now, you say you were growing up in an unsafe environment. Can you say a little bit more about that and how that might be connected to the voices that you were hearing?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a whole big story, really. My family were involved with a group of organised paedophiles, so I grew up in a very abusive environment from birth, and the people that were meant to protect me didn't protect me. They exploited and betrayed me. And, I'm very clear that my voices and other sort of experiences that I have and ways of coping that I have were really survival strategies. They were kind of things that I did as a young child to kind of cope with the unbearable reality that I was experiencing.
Wow, now that's not an uncommon connection, is that right? That children who have traumatic, abusive home environments will start to develop voices.
Well, it's from the research that's coming out, it seems that it's very, very common. And in fact, when I first started reading Marius Rom and Sandra Esch's work, I was really pleased that they were making that connection. Their research shows that 77% of people link hearing voices with traumatic life events like like sexual abuse and other forms of trauma. Not everybody who hears voices has been sexually abused, but certainly there's a link with traumatic life events. And there's a lot of other research that's been carried out subsequently, which really affirms what many of us with first-hand knowledge of madness know, that, bad things happen and they drive you crazy.
Yeah, I think it's really true. I mean, I'm someone who's heard voices. It's not as difficult or as bad or as pronounced as it was years ago when I was in the mental health system. But, I've struggled with voices and, unusual sensory experiences and altered states of consciousness since very early. And that was one of my own sort of recovery process, was to make the connection between the trauma that I've been through, the abusive experiences in my child, different kinds of trauma, not just family trauma, but also, surgical trauma that I went through, medical experiences that I went through, and things at school, like bullying experiences at school, all seem to be really interwoven. And a lot of the people over the years that I've spoken with who have different mental health diagnoses or get labeled with psychosis or voices, or they have this connection with trauma. And it's interesting that you, as a child, you developed positive voices as a way of coping with this. So it was really what was a helpful, protective experience for you.
Absolutely. And I think that's common for a lot of people, that they may be sort of very distressed by their voices, but either when they first began or even still whilst they're hearing distressing voices, there can be at least one positive voice. And sometimes the work is about trying to increase the volume of that voice before you start trying to work with the sort of more destructive voices. But as you say as well, a lot of people, will have had negative experiences in childhood or growing up. But then there will be other sort of experiences, and it's like cumulative, the kind of impact of bullying or poverty or racism or, a whole load of things that can kind of impact on somebody's kind of whole being, really. And I think there just is this kind of growing acknowledgement that, our lived experience is kind of what makes us who we are, including, hearing voices and madness and altered states of consciousness and all that stuff.
It's a pretty clear connection, the idea that overwhelming and crazy situations drive people crazy, drive people into madness. Now, Jacqui, I'm really interested in the experience of hearing voices itself that you've had, because I know that a lot of different people describe the voices differently, and I have had, in my own experience, a very different range of different kinds of things that happen to me. Some are very intrusive voices that are alien to me, that are in my head. Sometimes I hear voices that are outside of my head that are alien to me and intrusive. Other times I can hear noises, I hear machinery, I can sometimes hear conversations that are going on that seem really independent of me, and then other times things seem really directed to me. So can you tell us a little bit about your own experience of what exactly is it like for you to hear voices, and then how does that fit into kind of the range of diverse experiences that people have?
Well, I guess like you, I've had all of those experiences. I've heard voices in my head, outside my head. They've felt very frightening and intrusive. They've felt unconnected to me and quite alien to me. I was lying in bed last night and I suddenly heard sort of mechanical noises, and I said to my partner, can you hear that? Because I wasn't sure. Sometimes you need to just check out, is that kind of something that's just happening for me, or is it happening out there too? And he said, no, I can't hear that. And I couldn't really account for that, what that was about. So I have a whole range of experiences. I guess most commonly now, because I've done quite a lot of work with my voices, we have conversations, and often during the day, if I'm kind of preoccupied with work or my kids, they'll be in the back of my head talking to each other, sometimes about me, or as you say, about other things. And my head can feel quite full up, but I guess over time and experience, I've kind of adapted and found ways of kind of, like, the inside of my head feels quite big, so I'll just move to the front of my head and leave them at the back of my head. sort of doing what they're doing, and I'm at the front and kind of dealing with the world, as it were. I mean, I guess partly it's about my internal experience, and that for me, my sense of who I am inside is this kind of quite vast world, really, and how I kind of navigate that and how that interacts with the external world. I hope that makes sense.
Do you find talking with other voice hearers that people describe a lot of different ways that people hear voices?
I mean, I've heard a whole range of things, but I also think there's real commonalities of experience. There seems to be lots of, for example, voices that are very aggressive, or, voices that are sort of representing people's despair, so kind of telling people to hurt themselves, or, that kind of stuff. Voices that are commenting on what people are doing. I guess in my experience, people that experiences most of their voices from coming from outside sometimes struggle more to see the experience as being theirs, that it's a subjective experience, so people will be kind of looking for explanations in the environment, and that seems to happen more commonly, but not always. I mean, I'm loath to kind of, categorize really, because I don't think you can, and I just think that there are a whole range of experiences, that there do seem to be commonalities. Another kind of common thing is a split between good and evil. So, people will have a kind of a god and a devil, or a part of them, or a voice that is quite helpful, but there'll be another part that argues with that part. And so part of the work may be about actually sort of seeing the world in less black and white terms, that we aren't just good or bad.
One of the things that was helpful for me, for years, I would have a really strong, aggressive, just mean voice that I would hear. And then eventually I started to listen to it enough, and I recognized it as being a male voice and being my father's voice. And that was a big dramatic shift from what's happening to me to, oh, okay, this is connected to my family experience. When I first went into the mental health system, I had no sense of my family being traumatic or potentially I thought I had a good family. I mean, relatively speaking, I thought I was, so making that connection was really important to me. And one of the things I'm also curious about is I've noticed that when I have less stress in my life, I'm less likely to hear voices or have any kind of difficult altered states, but also mysteriously sometimes it doesn't make sense. Like I can be in a low stress situation and I'll have something happen to me that's a non-ordinary, a voice hearing experience or an altered state. Do you see that connection between stress and difficult situations and in your own experience with voice hearing?
Yeah, absolutely. There's somebody that I know, a friend and colleague, who says that for her, when her voices start increasing in volume, it's a sign she's stressed, and that her mum gets a migraine and her voices will increase. So I think lots of people kind of recognise that it can be an indicator of being stressed, hearing more voices. But of course there's lots of other things that trigger voices, and in the course of my work talking to people, I've just discovered that there can be very personal triggers. So you can, seemingly be going along fine, and then suddenly voices start. And much in the way that you describe, I think it's about sort of saying, well, what has happened to me? Something's triggered this for me. And sometimes it can be positive feelings. If they're unfamiliar, or if they're frightening, or if they're attached to bad things that may have happened, sometimes something good happening can make you feel really worried that it's going to be taken away, for example. So just kind of understanding yourself, seeing your voices as a part of you and your whole experience, I think is really important.
Now, going back to your childhood, you said that there was a point where growing up, your life kind of became more complicated, and then the voices got more complicated, and you started to have some negative voices. And so tell us more about what happened and then how that kind of developed.
I mean, I guess, it was paralleled by my increasing kind of desperation and the abuse kind of worsening, really. And perhaps just me getting older and developmentally becoming more conscious and aware about what was going on. So I think it was probably a combination of things. I mean, as a mum, I've seen that children's sort of developmental different stages in terms of their cognitions mean they're sort of able to think about things differently. So I imagine it was a combination of reasons, but I guess what happened for me is that the voices became more destructive and more critical. I began self-harming, and I began, I guess, experimenting with food. And I mean, they were all attempts, I think, to feel more in control. That's how I understand it now, my relationship with food and self-harm and all of those things.
So the sexual abuse that you experienced as a child had all these implications for all these different, what would be called mental illness symptoms by the system, but they're kind of really, really tied back to your abuse experiences, and they were all coping mechanisms or protective mechanisms that you were trying to develop for yourself.
I'm just working on a talk that I'm going to be giving later in the year, which is sort of focusing very much on those kinds of coping strategies and very much reframing them as survival strategies. And it was from a conversation I had with Marius Rom, and he turned to me and said, imagine a child being in that situation where they're experiencing a rape at the hands of somebody who's meant to be protecting them. And I said, yes, I can imagine it, you know. And it's like, for a child in that situation, they are literally fighting for their survival, you know, both during that sort of traumatic event and afterwards. And I think understanding how desperate somebody is in that situation and that actually they are doing what they can. They're doing their best.
Now, Jacqui, did you at some point turn to the mental health system? Did you go to counselors or a hospital? And what was your experience there?
As I said, I was abused by a group of organised paedophiles. So part of my experience was, you know, having a lot of threats to be silent, and so I never spoke about any of the abuse to anybody until my early 20s, because I was literally too terrified. And the thing that really liberated me to start talking was the birth of my first child. But like many mothers who've been abused, and many fathers actually, I've since discovered that just the experience of becoming a parent really just kind of takes the lid off of all of that stuff. And that's when things really started to kind of break down for me. My voices kind of got a lot worse, much more destructive. My self-harming increased. I became really, really kind of paranoid and terrified. And that led to me being admitted to a psychiatric hospital, which was, you know, in itself kind of pretty devastating. And, you know, so I'm in this hospital and very reluctantly kind of decided that I had to start talking about the abuse because, you know, at that time I was very clear that that's what was kind of making me feel so crazy. So I was being assessed by this psychiatrist, and we were in this room, and he's sort of asking me questions, and I basically said to him, you know, I want to tell you about some of the things that happened to me when I was growing up. And I started to tell him, and then he just said, can I stop you now? Actually, you know, we've had other people in here reporting these kinds of things, but actually when we get their families in and we all talk together, they realise that this is part of their illness. And, you know, these things haven't really happened to you.
Oh, wow. So you were trying to get help for very real crimes that had taken place that were at the basis of your distress and the crisis, and then you were told that was a delusion, that was a symptom of your schizophrenia? Is that what they were saying, that you were schizophrenic?
They never got to make that diagnosis, but that was certainly what they were thinking about and talking about. And, you know, yeah, they felt I was deluded.
That you were just psychotic, and this was just a symptom of an illness, like your brain was broken, or this was some biochemical thing. And so that's a really clear instance of psychiatry playing the role of social control and just really, in effect, protecting the abuser in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And silencing and, you know, and really kind of making me and a lot of other people feel more crazy, you know, just that kind of denial of your reality.
Jacqui, what year was that happened?
That would have been 1993.
But people should know that this is something that still happens all the time.
Well, it absolutely still happens, which is why we're talking today, Will. That's why I'm still here doing this stuff, because, I subsequently kind of got out of hospital and went and got myself some really good help, and that help kind of essentially was based on the premise that I was telling the truth and that everything I said made sense and was a kind of a consequence of what had happened to me. And but I felt so outraged really by my treatment, and what it would have meant if I'd listened to them and believed them, really, to deny my own experience in that way and to believe that I had an illness would have been true insanity, really.
So that was a very dangerous moment, but it sounds like you went in being clear that you were abused, but if somebody had gone in and they weren't quite sure or they were doubting themselves, then someone's life course could just be completely different.
Absolutely, and also there's a way that you could sort of say, I've heard other people's experiences where they'll sort of say to a psychiatrist, but what about the child sexual abuse? And they'll say, well, that's all in the past now. You need to deal with your mental illness. So I think psychiatry has lots of ways of dismissing and denying the impact of abuse, and kind of focusing on this sort of biochemical genetic problem.
With the treatment being medications, essentially.
Absolutely.
And that you have to stay on medications. And
yeah.
Yeah, and then it seems like the anger is a really important part of the healing process, but the medications can take you out of touch with your anger and sort of remove some of your own personal resources for your own natural healing process, and you get kind of stuck in that whole medication biological framework.
Completely. I mean, I think, that medication is very much used to silence people, and I think one of the things that I've seen is that when people do want to start working with their voices, that sometimes they need to start reducing their meds to kind of be able to start engaging emotionally with their own experience. Because, and for me, my anger, even though, again, the system kind of pathologized it, you're not allowed to be angry. A lot of my work was about kind of reclaiming that right to my outrage and to try and use it constructively, really, to try and channel it. Judith Herman, in her book Trauma and Recovery, talks about a survivor mission, because she really acknowledges that survivors have rage and that it's entirely appropriate, but that there is a need to kind of focus it, and often connecting with others who have a similar sense of outrage is a really powerful thing to do, and trying to bring about collective change. So I guess that's what I've tried to do with my rage.
And so, Jacqui, what really helped you was finding progressive therapists, is that right, who really validated your experience and said, yes, this did happen to you, and then let's go from there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we all need to be believed. It's kind of fundamental, really. If somebody's sort of saying, I don't believe you, then it's hard to kind of start with anything, really. And so for me, being believed and being respected, one of the things that I found really shocking in hospital is that there was no kind of acknowledgement that I was an intelligent woman who actually had lots of ideas about how to live with distress, because I'd been doing it all of my life. And suddenly I was expected to become very passive and do what I was told and be really infantilized. So for me, it was important to work with therapists that were kind of, acknowledging, but also really willing to share power with me, I guess.
Yeah, that idea that you have, and I think everyone has some degree of coping ability and their own insights and their own familiarity, because you've been living with these experiences your whole life. That's really important.
That idea that you are an expert by experience, and that everybody does have an inherent wisdom, and that I think part of my work is about kind of supporting people to kind of relocate that really in themselves, because I think part of what can happen in the system is that people lose that, and it's about kind of trying to help people reconnect with that.
The point you make about anger is so important, because I was just at a meeting a couple of weeks ago where they talked about someone who was going to be released from a locked facility, and the person just raised their voice, got angry in a meeting with their counselor, and boom, they were force drugged and they weren't released. And just the experience of anger itself is so pathologized. It's so turned into a symptom of your disease. And then you get into these control environments where anger is absolutely forbidden, and that can really, really harm people. It can really interrupt just a natural expression of feelings and emotions that people need to be able to have access to heal.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, a lot of the work I do with people is around anger, actually. There's a lot of work and around people's entitlement to anger and helping people to safely express it because, often people have experienced negative anger, people acting it out at them. And because they've been so silenced and kind of constrained, not being able to express their own anger and it feeling kind of destructive, and so for me, I remember my therapist giving me this poem years ago by a British poet, Stevie Smith, called Anger's Freeing Power, because he really recognised sort of, that a lot of my self-destructiveness was about this unexpressed anger, and a lot of my very sort of aggressive voices was about this unexpressed anger. And it was so liberating for me to sort of finally be able to be angry and embody that and feel entitled to it. As it's like self-worth, if somebody does you a wrong, it's entirely appropriate to feel angry about it. It's protective and it sets a boundary and it sort of expresses your value, doesn't it?
Yeah, and if you've lived with experiences where anger was always destructive and anger was always tied to violence and abuse, then yeah, you don't want to get angry because you have that association. And I think sometimes we can also get into a cultural thing where people don't want to be angry; they want to be nice all the time, and so anger gets really pushed down with a lot of negative consequences. If you're just tuning in, this is Madness Radio. We are speaking with Jacqui Dillon of the UK. She is a voice hearer and chair of the Hearing Voices Network in England. And we are speaking about the experience of hearing voices and the international movement of people who hear voices to help each other and change how the mental health system internationally responds to voice hearing. Jacqui, let's talk about the Hearing Voices movement. You mentioned Dr. Marius Rome, who's one of the developers of the Hearing Voices movement. And for people who don't know what the Hearing Voices movement is, how did it get started? What's the story with the origins of it?
Well, it started about 22 or so years ago. I guess the pioneers are Professor Marius Rome, who is a Dutch psychiatrist, and his partner, Dr. Sandra Escher. She was originally a scientific journalist, and a woman called Patsy Haag. And Patsy initially was a patient of Marius, and she'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia. She was hearing voices. And at that time, Marius was treating her, he believed in schizophrenia and was treating her in the kind of traditional way, mainly through administering neuroleptic medication. And really, she, asked him to start treating her differently, and really challenged him. And it was really through his work with Patsy that they began to research the phenomenon of hearing voices. That was really the start of the Hearing Voices movement.
So it really came from a patient who was pushing for a different way.
Patsy turned around to Marius and said to him, why is it that you go to church and pray to a God that you can't see, yet my voices aren't real? And as a rational scientific man, this really struck him as a kind of very valid question, because of course there are these kind of culturally accepted delusions, like, praying to a God that you can't see, that, culturally we define as okay beliefs, but then other beliefs that are not perhaps shared by a whole load of people are deemed meaningless. And I think, that idea for him was really significant. The consequence, they kind of invited voice hearers to a big conference. In fact, they went on Dutch TV, Marius and Patsy, and spoke about voice hearing and asked people to phone in. And they got several hundred calls afterwards. And astonishingly, a lot of calls from people who'd never used services, who'd never sort of, been mentally ill, as it were. And so, again, for the first time, Marius encountered a whole group of people who were voice hearers that had never been patients, who'd never been diagnosed with any illness. So again, it questioned this idea that hearing voices was an illness.
And that also people were experiencing voices but just living with them, and it wasn't that distressing for them. They just learned ways of just living with their voices.
Exactly. And I think, a lot of the strategies that we've developed and ways of working with voices have entirely come from people who've lived with hearing voices, because they know best about how to live with voices. So Maris and Sandra and other people have interviewed hundreds of people who hear voices and asked them in great detail about their experience and in great detail about how they live with that experience. And yeah, that's helped us kind of really develop knowledge and expertise around living with these kind of what can be difficult experiences.
Now, after the experience of going on Dutch television and sort of finding that there were so many people out there, is that when they started the first Hearing Voices groups? And tell us about how that got started and how the groups work.
An organisation called Resonance was formed, which is the Dutch Hearing Voices Network, which still exists to this day. Somebody from the UK, somebody called Paul Baker, was at that original conference in Maastricht and basically came back to England and was just kind of, really inspired by this, invited Maris and Sandra to England to give some talks, and really that inspired people here to form the first group back in 1988 in Manchester. So Manchester is Hearing Voices Network, England's spiritual home, and I say that as a Londoner. So that was the first group. So that was sort of 21 years ago.
And what happens in these groups? This is a place for people who hear voices to share experiences, or how does it work? And are counselors involved, and is there partnership with the system, or how does it actually happen?
Well, I guess it's evolved and it happens in lots of different ways, but essentially what a Hearing Voices group is a group of people who meet, who share the experience of hearing voices, and hearing voices in itself is a taboo experience. It's not something that people can easily share in ordinary life. And of course, voices often talk about taboo things. Certainly taboo for the individual, they're very private things and things that people find difficult to share. So I guess initially it was about providing a sort of safe place where people could share those taboo experiences. But then I guess it's also important to kind of remember that in traditional settings, if people talk about their voices, there's a risk of forced medication, loss of liberty, a whole load of things can happen which have silenced people. So, it's quite radical, really, to create a space where people could talk freely about this taboo experience and nothing happened. That was really important. And really that idea, has continued to this day. But groups run now in a variety of settings. In England alone, there are 182 Hearing Voices groups. So that's a lot of groups just in England. Scotland has its own network, and so does Wales.
So over the 20 years of these Hearing Voices groups, there's been a growing recognition that they actually do help people. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. And we've run groups in the community, so, with grassroots community organisations. We've run groups in acute statutory settings. We've run groups in prisons. We're currently running a group in the high security hospital. At the end, the National Health Service here, runs a lot of groups or is involved in running groups. So it's something that is both outside and inside, really, traditional services, and has certainly become more incorporated.
Now, Jacqui, are there studies that are starting to show from a kind of a scientific point of view that, yes, these are helpful, and yes, they do reduce people's distress and help people stay out of hospitals and stay out of crisis and that kind of thing?
Well, there are some small quantitative studies that look at things like, does it decrease the amount of admissions that somebody has? I guess the problem is that, we're kind of wary of trying to fit ourselves into those kind of clinical categories, really, because, going to a group isn't necessarily about a reduction in symptoms. I don't think about voices as symptoms. That's very much sort of buying into sort of medical paradigm, and my voice is a part of my experience, and so it may not be about getting rid of symptoms, and you can't necessarily sort of quantify somebody's life experience. So I guess what we're more interested in is kind of qualitative research, and in part the new book that we've got coming out is that really. It's our evidence. It's qualitative research that shows how this stuff works and why it works and why it's effective.
And the experience with medications, I mean, people in the group, some of them take medications, some of them don't. People sometimes are reducing medications.
Yeah, a whole load of things. Again, I mean, it's quite common for people to be on medication. It's a lot of people will have come via the psychiatric system. Many people who attend groups are still using services in different ways. So, so therefore a lot of people will be taking medication. And, the reality is that medication's only effective for 33% of people. That's, World Health Organization figure. And out of that 33% of people, only 50% of people will, experience a significant benefit from that, and the other 50% will have varying degrees of benefit. So, there's a significant number of people who don't find any benefit, or particularly around their voices. They may feel less bothered because they're sedated. But yeah, there's a whole load of issues really around medication. I think, people have a lot of concerns about taking it, and there are a lot of effects beyond potentially therapeutic ones.
Now, in terms of the criticism that the groups or the approach get, you mentioned that it's just pretty much a taboo in the mental health system to talk about voices, and that's really seen as, you're just going to kind of make things worse by talking about them, and you were silenced when you were getting traditional treatment. And what about the concern that some people have? I mean, I think it's really from a stereotype and fear that, these voices, they're out of control and they could be telling you to commit acts of violence, and that we really can't let people be in the society. We really need to, if you hear voices, it's a dangerous thing, and you need to be getting treatment from a doctor.
Lots of people I know hear voices telling them to kill people, and they've never done it, and I've actually know lots of people who don't hear voices that have had the impulse to kill people and have never done it either.
Right, which is a good point. That's the impulse to kill people is actually not that uncommon, just like the impulse to commit suicide. It's just something we don't talk about. So
exactly, and I had a real learning lesson, many years ago when I first started doing this work, and I was talking to a woman about her voices. And she was saying to me, "Oh dear, they're telling me to kill myself, and it's really awful." And I was sort of employed, and I remember sort of feeling really alarmed. Am I going to kind of be responsible here, and what do I do? And feeling really panicked. Should I alert somebody? But I don't want to do that. And so I just said to her, "Well, how long has it been going on for?" And she went, "About 20 years, dear." And I just sort of thought, okay, don't make assumptions here, don't panic, actually ask questions, and this woman has been living with these voices telling her to do this for 20 years and had never done it because she didn't always do what they told her to do. I think actually if people are hearing voices telling them to hurt themselves or somebody else, actually it makes more sense to ask more questions about that, because then you're going to make more sense of it, rather than just medicating somebody and hoping it will go away, because that's essentially what they're doing in doing that.
Yeah, and not talking about it and not grappling with it and being alone with it can make things worse. And we have a system now where just talking about, I have a voice that says to kill someone, that can just get you locked up. So people aren't very inspired to talk about these experiences when you can get into trouble for them. What are some of the coping techniques? I know that a lot of the real approach is to develop ways to have acceptance and to learn to live with the voices. What are some of the recurring methods that people develop and can learn to better handle their experiences of hearing voices?
Well, I guess, it depends on where the person is in relation to their voices. When people feel very overwhelmed and that their voices have a lot of power and control, often what I might suggest is actually learning some distraction techniques and learning some techniques that actually start redressing the imbalance, really, in the relationship between the person and their voices. So we have lots of sort of what we would call short-term strategies where we might say to voices, I'm not going to listen to you for the next 5 minutes, and then the person might extend that to 20 minutes, half an hour. People start making appointments with voices, say to voices, I'll listen to you at 3 o'clock. And actually what you're trying to do is renegotiate the boundaries of the relationship. And that takes, it can take a lot of persistence, but it is stuff that works. And hopefully once the person feels a little bit more in control, then they can start perhaps asking the voices questions more directly. One of the things that I personally have found hugely important, and I've seen it in other people, is actually changing your attitude to the voices as well. If you've got voices that are being very abusive to you and then you're responding in an abusive way, you're just kind of perpetrating this very abusive dynamic. And a real turning point for me, and I've seen it with a lot of other people, is when you actually develop a more compassionate attitude towards your voices and a more accepting attitude. And that actually starts shifting the relationship with the voices.
Yeah, and I think understanding your own trauma can help you to really see yourself much more compassionately and say, wow, it makes sense that I'm having this horrible voice in my head because of look at what I went through.
And I think that kind of work really supports that process. I think if people just are trying to work with voices in isolation without really linking it to their lived experience, then, they're going to kind of hit some obstacles, really. I think the work is, as you say, a lot about really linking the voices to things that have happened. One of the things that Marius Rom and Sandra Escher and Patsy Haag developed was the Maastricht interview, which was initially a research tool, but it's been adapted for use in therapy. And that asks lots and lots of questions about voices and the different voices that people hear. But that actually helped gather a lot of this knowledge about, the different way that people experience voices. And often when voices started, who the main voices are, like you gave the example of the voice of your dad. People's dominant voices are often voices that are connected to sort of dominant people in their lives, for example. So doing that kind of work really supports the making sense of the voices and the learning to live with the voices.
There was a long period of my life where I had a really difficult time going out into public, and I would find that, I would just have all these problems, including voices, when I would go out into public. And then just making the connection, it sounds really simple, but making the connection, just like you said, to be able to distract myself and to go out with headphones and listening to music was something that was really helpful for me. And it sounds really simple, but when you're really confused and overwhelmed, making those simple kinds of connections and making those simple kinds of steps can be really difficult. And when I also had an experience where I was hearing voices on the other side of my wall, and I was just convinced that they were planning things and talking about me, and I was so bent out of shape by this that it was just really making it really hard to just be at home and feel safe at home. And so I put a fan on that made ambient noise, really loud fan in my apartment, and it helped to create this background distraction that really helped me to cope with it. So, and I think your point also is that a lot of people have different coping strategies, and so it's not about an expert coming up with a prescription. It's about people coming together in groups and sharing experiences and trading what they've learned with each other and kind of trying different things. Jacqui, I'm interested also in this really fascinating side to the whole experience of where the voices are positive. And, I think we have, historically, we have a lot of examples, both, I'm thinking of like Joan of Arc, I'm thinking about poets that hear muses, I'm thinking about people who are spiritual saints and prophets who hear voices. There's a huge cultural sort of heritage to the voice hearing experience. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how it might be connected to some of these negative experiences, or do sometimes people have their negative voices kind of turn into positive voices? And is there a creative and spiritual positive side to this as well?
Yeah, there's lots I could say about that. I guess partly it's about, how we define these things. There's lots of places in the world where, for example, schizophrenia doesn't exist currently. And, hearing voices wouldn't, or psychosis as we call it, wouldn't be thought of in those terms. So it's a very sort of Western way of thinking about those experiences. And a couple of hundred years ago, in the West, they would have been thought about very differently. And historically, voices have been thought about very differently, much more positively. much more seen as a human experience. And as you said, there are lots of sort of significant people, Jesus, Muhammad, Socrates, Plato, Pythagoras, lots and lots of Blake, Descartes, Goethe, Freud, Jung. They all talked about hearing voices, and many, many more. And it was a significant experience, it was an important experience for them. And as to how do we, I've pondered that question, why is it that for some people, particularly in the past, these things would have been seen or used in a more positive way. But although perhaps some of those people were tormented as well, and I guess it is what, human beings do with their experiences, and I guess my sort of gut feeling is that voices come from some kind of overwhelming experience. And that could be any number of things. And it's kind of what we do with it,
Including the overwhelming experience of contacting God or contacting spirit.
Exactly, yeah. Any overwhelming experience that we find hard to integrate, I guess.
How about your work today? I know you're involved with the upcoming World Congress on Hearing Voices. You are involved with an anthology, and you're also involved with the campaign to abolish the schizophrenia label.
That's right. Yeah, lots of exciting stuff going on. I'm really excited by the World Congress. Every year we have an intervoice meeting. So, there's an international Hearing Voices network. So it's something that's been sort of very popular and successful and grown in the UK. But it's spreading across the world, including in Oregon, which I was delighted to hear about. So we're having this World Congress this year in Maastricht, and so far we have over 80 presenters from all over the world signed up to give keynote talks, presentations, workshops, all sorts of things going on. We've got artists coming, musicians. So it's going to be a really spectacular event.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I'm actually signed up to go and present at the Congress myself if I can swing the money to get there, but I'm hoping to be able to make it out. And we are starting a Hearing Voices group here in Portland, Oregon, so there's a lot going on.
Absolutely, and I know there are other people coming from the US, and the US is one of the places where this movement hasn't taken off in the same way that it has in other parts of the world. So
why do you think that is, Jacqui? I have some of my own thoughts, but what is your sense of that?
My sense is, my main thought on that is that because of the kind of stranglehold of the pharmaceutical industry.
That's about it, yeah.
Yeah, in a nutshell. I mean, I guess there are issues about such a vast country and about your healthcare system and politics, and there are kind of other issues, but I think the biggest, clearest issue is the pharmaceutical industry. They're just a huge obstacle.
I think also there's a stronger tradition in the UK of seeing madness psychologically. I guess you don't quite have as strong of the whole biological, biomedical approach there as we do here in the US.
Yeah, perhaps. There's a different kind of history, and I don't know. I've had these conversations with other people. There's a different kind of history politically in this country, and I think there's lots of different things. It's, and it's kind of speculation, but I'm really hopeful that will change. And because the great thing about this work is that it doesn't take a lot of money. And what it takes is a small group of committed people really getting together and just trying to sort of change their own worlds, really. And in doing that is a very powerful thing to do.
We don't have a lot of time, but tell us quickly about the campaign to abolish the schizophrenia label, and also if people want to find out more about the Hearing Voices movement and about your work, if you can point us to resources and how to contact you.
Briefly, the campaign to abolish the schizophrenia label, it's an alliance between a group of academics, clinicians, service users, activists, carers, families, friends, people that really are saying that the label schizophrenia needs to be abolished because it's unscientific, it's stigmatizing, and it doesn't address the root causes of mental distress. And what's quite exciting about it is that we do have some sort of quite key psychiatrists and scientists involved who are supporting this and are asking for the label to be abolished. So I know that you've got a link on the Freedom Centre site. If people are interested in finding out more, they can go to www.casl, that's CASL, campaign.com. If people want to find out more about the International Hearing Voices Network, they should check out www.intervoiceonline.org, and that will tell them more about the Congress and what's going on around the world. And for the Hearing Voices Network in England, www.hearing-voices.org.
Jacqui Dillon, thank you for joining us today on Madness Radio.
That's great. Cheers. Well, that was brilliant. I enjoyed it.
You've been listening to an interview with Jacqui Dillon. She is a voice hearer and chair of the Hearing Voices Network in England and actively involved internationally in the Hearing Voices movement. That's all the time we have this week on Madness Radio. Thanks a lot for tuning in. You've been listening to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health. Madness Radio broadcasts every Tuesday, 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern, on Pacifica affiliates WXOJ Lpfm, Northampton, Massachusetts, and KWMD Kasilof and Anchorage, Alaska. Co-produced by peer-run mental health communities freedom-center.org and the Icarus Project.net. Madness Radio is hosted by Will Hall. Music producer is John Rice, with technical assistance from Jeremy Landsman. Listen to our internet stream, podcasts, and show archives at madnessradio.net. If you have an idea for a story or guest on Madness Radio, to help get us broadcast on a station near you, or if you just want to share what's in your head, contact radio@madnessradio.net.